In this story, I'm going to tell you how I made the man who lied to me carry his betrayal on his wrist forever. I was the quiet librarian everyone trusted. He thought that made me harmless. But when I found photos of him kissing someone else, I didn't scream, I didn't smash anything. I set a private, surgical plan, witnesses, a recording, and one small, permanent reminder he would wear every day. Stay with me and I'll walk you through the exact steps I used to expose him, protect myself, and make sure he could never rewrite the story. My name is Evelyn Hart. I am 34 and I live in Portsmouth, New Hampshire in a narrow clapboard house that smells faintly of lemon oil and old paper. I'm a librarian at a small community library on the waterfront. Patrons expect me to be quiet, patient, gentle. That is part of who I am, the public face people nod to when they see me shelving returns or helping a child choose their first mystery. But it is not the whole story. I grew up on a working boatyard 2 towns over, summers spent knee-deep in grease and salt, my skin perpetually sunburned and my hair a tangle of wind. My father taught me how to splice rope and how to hold my ground when men tried to tell me I did not belong. From him, I learned the slow, stubborn muscles of endurance and the small, private pride of finishing what you start. Lately, life felt like a slow tide pulling me under. I had been seeing Mark for almost a year. He could be charming, attentive at Sunday markets, remembering small things I'd offhandedly mentioned. Other days he was distant, his laughter clipped, his explanations thin. He worked in facilities at the university and always carried a faint aroma of coffee and machine oil, which I had once found oddly comforting. We kept things private. I liked it that way. I had a messy marriage behind me and a promise tucked into my bones. Never again would I let someone take my dignity. Then a neighbor, someone I watered plants for and waved to at the post office, told me she had seen Mark with another woman at a downtown bar. They looked close, she said, leaning over her fence as if confiding a garden secret. I tried to swallow the rumor, to let it pass like gulls over the harbor, but small things started adding up. His phone would light up and he would step outside for long minutes. He became vague about weekends, citing vague projects. A mutual friend who once invited us to dinners suddenly avoided my questions with a kind of weary distance. On a quiet Tuesday, a colleague I barely knew sent me pictures taken behind the brewery, Mark kissing someone else. The images hit me like pebbles dropped into the shallow water of my life. The ripples reached everywhere. I felt the ground shift beneath me. Hurt pulsed first, nauseous, sharp, followed by a cold, angry clarity. I had left a painful marriage years ago and promised myself I would not be small again. That promise hardened into a plan. I began to think about how to respond. I did not want a spectacle, public scenes churned into gossip that never dies. I wanted something private, thorough, and final, something that would teach him what it meant to replace and lie. I also wanted to protect myself, to ensure that whatever I did could not be spun into evidence of my losing control. Mark liked to show off. Vanity sat on him like a jacket he refused to take off. He knew I recorded things, notes, receipts, small obsessive files I kept for the comfort of order. He joked it was cute, and because he was careless about his image, he let his guard down. I started planning quietly. I made lists timing his shifts, mapping his routes, lining up people who might help. I learned which bars he favored and which friends he leaned on. I waited for a moment when he would feel untouchable and I would be steady. I imagined a revenge that was not fireworks and ruin but a precise exposure. A ledger of truth presented calmly, like a librarian cataloging every offense. The waiting taught me patience, and patience turned my hurt into a cold, clean intent. I tried to solve the problem the straightforward way at first. I confronted him gently over coffee, asked honest questions, and watched him fumble. He lied and minimized. He said it had been a mistake, that he was confused, that the other woman was nothing. The excuses felt like cheap bandages across a wound that needed stitches. I pushed harder, demanded names and places, and he deflected, blamed me for prying, told me I was being dramatic. That made me angrier. I went to the brewery where the photos were taken and spoke to the bartender, who admitted Mark and the woman left together on more than one occasion. I asked friends if they had seen anything else. One friend told me Mark had been seen with the woman at a small house party 2 weekends ago, and another mentioned he had been late to work a lot. Each answer tightened the coil inside me. I thought about walking away and burning the relationship with silence, but the betrayal felt bigger than my pride. I started to act more aggressively. There were small, careful steps at first, copying messages, taking screenshots of his social media, making a timeline in my notebook with neat, librarian-ruled lines. I cataloged moments, dates he'd been evasive, the brewery photos, the bar receipts. The project steadied me, focusing on facts kept the rawness at bay. Still, facts alone did not stop his story from spreading. When I tried to speak to him again, he smoothed his face into that practiced expression of contrition and spun plausible half-truths. I wanted a demonstration of honesty, not a performance. I told a coworker I trusted that I might need help, and she agreed to be my witness for a last conversation. The plan felt humiliating and precise in equal measure. Lure him into my apartment like nothing was wrong, so I could force clarity where he had offered only fog. I messaged Mark to meet me that evening. When he arrived, he wore the same careless smile he used around other women, a smile that used to feel private in my presence and now felt like a public stage. I had prepared a table with boxes ready to go, a small ritual of departure that made the possibility of leaving concrete. But when I opened my mouth, he doubled down on lies and laughed in a way that made my skin crawl. I tried to grab his phone to search for messages, which made things worse. He pushed back, saying I had no right, and pushed me too. For the first time since I was a teenager, I lost my cool. I shoved him hard enough for him to spill his coffee. He shoved back. Our neighbor banged on my door, scolding us to keep the noise down. My heart raced. The apartment felt too small for the heat between us. In that rush, I did something I would later regret and then understand differently. I took a key piece of his vanity. He always wore a watch he bragged about, said it was a gift from a previous girlfriend who had loved him long and foolishly. It hung on his wrist like proof of his own desirability. I slipped it into my bag with hands that were both trembling and certain, and I told him to leave. He left, swearing, threatening to tell everyone I had assaulted him. The next day, the story had a different arc. He posted a half-true version on social media, twisting details to fit the narrative of the wronged man. I could have called the police, but I pictured hours of paperwork and people choosing sides based on charm and convenience. Instead, Mark began texting my friends, trying to salvage his image. His new woman messaged our mutuals with her version. The rumor mill turned against me despite the photographs I had been sent. I felt smaller and more boxed in than ever. That was my lowest point. I replayed every detail in bed at night. The way he laughed, the heat of the shove, the light on the watch face as I slipped it into the bag. Guilt sat beside fury and they argued. My impulsive act had given him a fresh script. He cast himself as the victim, and suddenly my anger looked like instability. Everything I had worked to protect, my position at the library, friendships, the quiet life I cherished, hung by thread. I began to doubt whether revenge was worth the cost. But when the shame and fear settled into a hollow place, a different clarity came. I had acted but haphazardly. His counterattack was working because it relied on narrative, not proof. If I wanted the truth to stand, I would need to make it hard for him to rewrite. I needed something final, something precise and unavoidable that would force the facts into daylight and put him where he had put me, exposed, embarrassed, and accountable. The thought steadied me in a way fury alone never had. This would not be a spectacle born of pain. It would be calculated, measured, the kind of correction that left no room for his preferred version of events. I made a final plan, and it required timing, allies, and a little theater. I reached out to the bartender who had seen them and asked if he would help me orchestrate a meeting on a Friday when Mark typically closed early. He agreed to give me a heads up when Mark came in with the woman, and he promised to save us a private booth. I also asked a trusted friend from the university, someone 2 meters tall and capable of carrying heavy boxes, to be nearby. We both got tested for sexually transmitted infections just to be safe, because I did not want health surprises from desperate choices to complicate my life. I also asked a tech-savvy friend to help me prepare an audio recording of a conversation I intended to provoke. I wanted a record of his admissions, not just hearsay and photos. I waited for the Friday that fit his pattern. Mark arrived at the bar with his new woman, confident and laughing. The bartender saved the booth and gave us a signal. I walked in like any patron, sat at the bar, and ordered a drink. I let Mark see me. He looked startled but tried to be cool. The woman smiled a little too widely. The bartender gave me a subtle nod, and my big friend took a seat at a table with his back to Mark but within sight. I had set the trap to let Mark talk before I spoke. I let him approach and boast about his new fling to anyone who would listen. He made the same throwaway remarks he had made to me, that he was single, that he was better off, that the other woman was different. I kept my face calm. When the moment was right, I slipped into the booth with my bag and a small, neatly labeled envelope. I invited them to join me and started a casual conversation as though we were strangers. Then I asked a simple question: how long had they been seeing each other? Mark, foolishly confident in front of witnesses, answered with a smirk and a number. The woman corroborated and laughed. That was when I slid the envelope across the table. Inside were copies of the photos I had received, labeled with dates and locations, and a single photograph of his expensive watch on my table with its serial number circled. I told them that my neighbor had sent me the first photos, that I had been patient and tried to speak with Mark, and that I had given him a chance to be honest. I set the small audio recorder on the table and said I had a recording of him admitting that he had been involved with this woman for months. The woman went pale and looked at Mark like she had been stabbed. Mark shifted in his seat and began to stammer. I told them exactly what he had done. The lies, the late nights, the little betrayals. I did not yell, I did not beg. I simply presented the facts like a librarian cataloging a case, precise, unemotional, and final. The bartender and the witnesses at nearby tables watched as the woman checked Mark's phone and saw the timestamps. She rose abruptly and fled into the alley, calling someone on the way. Mark reached for his watch, reached for his phone, tried to say something clever, but there was no room left for performance. My friend at the table stood up as my signal and quietly asked the bartender to hand the watch to me. I opened it, turned it over, and removed the band. I had a locksmith friend prepare a simple engraving. On the inside of the watch band, I had put a single small phrase, "You chose to betray her." The band was returned to me with a tool, and I slipped a small note inside the case where the battery goes, a note that read, "Remember how you treated her." I did not destroy the watch. I could have sold it or smashed it, but I chose a more pointed humiliation, the knowledge that he would carry that little reminder every time he looked at the time. He sat there exposed, and people around us nodded and whispered. The woman left without saying another word. Mark tried to look angry and wronged, but the witnesses and the photos had already narrated the truth. I watched as his mask slid off. He realized he could not control the story anymore. After that night, things settled into a new normal, but normal felt different now, leaner, clearer, like a room with one window opened wide. Word spread, not in the shout of scandal, but in quiet confirmations and awkward silences that said more than gossip ever could. People who had been uncertain about where to stand came by with small, contrite breaths. An apology slipped over the circulation desk, a careful hello that acknowledged they'd seen the receipts I had sent privately to those who needed to know. The bartender got fewer questions and more shrugs. The woman who had been with him left the university quietly, her face drawn when she passed me in the staff kitchen. Mark tried to spin it, at first by charm and later by complaint, but most people had already seen the photographs or heard the recording I'd set in motion. He could no longer rely on the comfortable anonymity he used to lie. When I filed a modest complaint with Human Resources about his conduct towards staff, the review that followed was clinical and efficient. He was moved to another department, an administrative exile, less a punishment than a rearrangement that made his presence less visible and his lies less plausible. I had not wanted fireworks. I did not seek to ruin him. What I wanted was consequence, to show that duplicity carried weight, and that the small violences of lying had a public cost. The watch engraving turned into a private joke among a handful of friends, a little cruel perhaps, but also true. They teased me that I'd left the poor man with a fashionable conscience, and one friend made a game of slipping the phrase, "You chose to betray her," into conversation as an absurdist proverb. I laughed with them because laughter is a kind of bandage. I was not untouched. The ache of betrayal lingered under the newly ordered surface of my days. There were mornings I woke with the raw memory of the shove, the hollowed feeling of having trusted someone and found a hollow in return. Nights when the town was quiet, I would sometimes picture Mark's smirk in slow motion, because once a face has been catalogued, it returns unbidden. Yet there was also steadiness, a slow, practical recovery that came from doing what I had decided and from anchoring myself in small things that mattered. I refocused on work, reshelving donations, renewing interlibrary loans, helping a child find the exact picture book that made her belly laugh. I volunteered with the literacy program on Tuesday evenings and watched adults unlock a stubborn word. Their progress felt like slow tide lines returning to shore. I mended friendships. Some needed time, others needed a simple shared cup of coffee and a willingness to listen without defending. I even signed up for evening sailing lessons again, letting the salt and wind remind me that movement is its own kind of forgiveness. Life moved forward in sensible increments. Months later, in a moment that felt almost anticlimactic, Mark came into the library. He said he had been looking for a book on time management. He stood in front of the counter for a long second, as if measuring what to say. Then, with the same guarded smile he had always reserved for polite interactions, he slipped the watch across my desk without a word and left as quietly as he had come. I turned the watch over in my hands, felt the cool metal and the old engravings, and tucked it into a small box. I could have opened it then, asked him why, demanded apologies, or let a sharp retort fly. Instead, I slid the box into the shelf where I kept things that belonged to other people, an unglamorous lost and found of bad choices and quieter lessons. Placing it there felt like a final, private verdict. I had not screamed, I had not been undone. I kept the last word without theatrics. Life, I learned, carries its own answers. The tide turns whether or not you shout at the water.